All right, everybody, welcome back to another deep dive. Every 4 years when the election rolls around, it gets everybody thinking about the power of the president, the executive branch.
Oh, yeah.
And it gets us thinking, how much power does the president really have? Should they have more? Should they have less? That sort of thing.
Right.
Well, speaking of presidential power, there's this really common fun fact, or what people think is a fun fact, from history.
Yeah.
It's a good story.
Mhm.
It's about George Washington and being offered the position of King of America.
Oh, yeah, I've read that one.
Yeah. And of course he turns it down because, he's George Washington.
Right, he's the father of our country.
Exactly. So today we're going to do a deep dive into this story, see if it's actually true and if not, where it came from.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah. And our source material today is from the King George Washington I episode of the Noble Blood podcast.
Okay.
So let's jump right in. Is this story really true?
Well, the quick answer is no, not really.
Not really.
Yeah.
So there's some truth to it.
It's more complicated than that.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So the source of this Washington offered a crown story is actually a single letter.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just one letter written by Colonel Louis Nicola. He was an officer in the Continental Army,
Okay.
and the Army at this point was struggling. They weren't getting paid. They weren't getting pensions.
Oh, right. Yeah, things weren't exactly a party for the Continental Army after the war.
No, they weren't. And Nicola was worried about it. So in this letter, he suggests this plan to Washington.
A plan for what exactly?
Well, he wanted to create a new state, west of the colonies for all the veterans.
Okay, so like a veteran state. Interesting.
Right. And he thought it should be governed by a constitutional monarchy.
A monarchy. Hold on. So he's talking about a king.
Yeah. And he suggests that Washington should be the head of it.
Whoa. So this is where the king idea comes from, just this one guy's letter.
Yeah, pretty much. He
Well,
never
yeah.
actually directly offers a crown, but he definitely suggests the title of king might be a good fit.
Huh. So it wasn't really a formal offer, more like a what if kind of thing.
Exactly. And of course, Washington immediately shuts him down.
Really? I mean, I guess I'm not surprised.
He was not happy about it at all. He basically said it was a terrible idea and wanted nothing to do with it.
That's pretty clear.
Mm.
So if the story's not really true, why does it persist? Why do we keep hearing it?
Well, think about it. It's a good story, right?
Yeah, it's definitely dramatic.
It fits this image of Washington as this incredibly virtuous leader who chooses democracy over power.
It's very romanticized.
Right. And there was even this biographer who perpetuated the myth, years later.
Really. So even the experts can fall for a good story.
It seems so. The episode mentions that.
So if Washington didn't actually turn down a crown, what was his real impact on preventing America from becoming a monarchy?
Well, he played a huge role in preventing a military coup.
Oh, right. The Newburgh conspiracy.
Exactly. Remember, the army wasn't getting paid and they were getting really frustrated.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Some of the officers were actually talking about overthrowing the government.
Wow. So it was a real threat.
It was. And Washington stepped in and gave this really powerful speech called the Newburgh Address.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
He basically shamed the officers who were considering mutiny, appealed to their patriotism. There's this really cool detail about him putting on his spectacles to read a letter during the speech.
Oh, yeah. That's supposed to be a really humanizing moment, right?
It is, and it apparently resonated with the troops. He basically convinced them to stand down and trust the process.
Wow. So he really saved the country from potential dictatorship.
He played a key role in preventing it, that's for sure. He ensured that civilian control of the army would continue.
That's amazing. So even though he didn't turn down a crown, he did something arguably even more important.
Right. He ensured the survival of the republic.
So this whole King George story is a lot more complicated than we thought.
It is. But it's a good example of how history can get distorted over time.
Right? And how much we love those stories that reinforce our national identity.
Exactly. Speaking of interesting twists, though, did you know that Washington actually does have a royal connection?
Wait, you're kidding, right?
I'm serious. He's related to Queen Elizabeth II.
No way. Okay, we have to talk about this, but first we got to take a quick break. Be right back, folks.
This distantly, like second cousin 7 times removed.
Second cousin 7 times removed.
Okay.
Okay, that's pretty distant.
It is, but still it's a connection.
So how does this family tree work? How do we get from George Washington to Queen Elizabeth?
Well, it all starts with Washington's great-grandfather, Augustine Warner Jr.
Okay.
He had 2 daughters. Mildred and Mary.
Okay.
Mildred is Washington's grandmother, but it's Mary's descendants who eventually lead to the royal connection.
Oh, so we're following Mary's line.
Exactly. So Mary's daughter, also named Mary, married a man named John Smith, and their descendants eventually left Virginia.
So they moved to England.
Yeah, they settled in Ripon, North Yorkshire.
Okay, so the Washington family connection is in England now.
Right. And generations later, Mary's great-grandson, Robert Hodgson Jr., became the Dean of Carlisle.
The Dean of Carlisle.
And then his daughter, Henrietta, married into a family that was pretty influential. They were directors of the East India Trading Company.
Oh, wow. So they were pretty wealthy then.
Very wealthy and well-connected.
Yeah.
And that's how Henrietta's daughter, Frances Doris Smith, was able to marry into nobility.
Here we go. The royal connection is getting closer.
She married Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 13th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn.
An earl. Okay, so we're in the aristocracy now.
Yeah, and their son, the 14th Earl, had a daughter named Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon.
That name sounds familiar.
Well, she married the Duke of York, who later became King George VI.
Oh, wow. Because of Edward VIII and the abdication.
That's right. Edward gave up the throne to marry Wallis Simpson and the Duke of York. Elizabeth's husband became king.
And that means their daughter is...
Queen Elizabeth II.
Wow. So George Washington, the father of American democracy,
Yeah.
is related to the Queen of England.
It's a crazy connection, right?
It is. It's like something out of a movie.
It really highlights how interconnected history is.
Yeah, and how much we might not know.
Exactly. You think you know a story, and then bam, there's this whole other layer to it.
So we've got this myth about Washington being offered a crown, his real actions to prevent a military coup, and now this royal connection.
It's all part of the same story in a way.
What do you mean?
Well, it shows how history is never simple. It's full of surprises and contradictions.
Right. And maybe it's those contradictions that make it so interesting.
I think so. It keeps us guessing. Keeps us wanting to learn more.
Well, I know I've learned a lot today, and I'm definitely going to be looking at history a little differently from now on.
I think that's the point of these deep dives, isn't it?
Yeah, it's about challenging our assumptions and getting a more complete picture of the past.
And maybe even uncovering some royal connections along the way.
You never know. But seriously, though, this whole episode has made me wonder about other historical facts that we take for granted.
Yeah, like what?
Well, like, are there other stories that we think are true, but are actually based on myths or misunderstandings?
That's a great question. And it's something we should all be thinking about. You know, we can't just accept everything we hear at face value.
Right. We have to be critical thinkers and do our own research.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe we'll uncover some more surprising connections along the way.
That's what makes history so fascinating. There's always something new to discover. It makes you wonder, though, what if Washington had said yes to the idea of being king?
Oh, wow. That's a big what if.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to think about. Like, how would America be different?
Completely different. I mean, would we even be America as we know it?
Probably not.
Uh-huh.
I mean, a monarchy sets up a whole different power structure.
Yeah, and a whole different culture, really.
Yeah.
Think about how monarchies have shaped European history.
Right, they had a huge impact on everything, from social structures to wars to how countries are run.
And then there's the whole lineage thing, you know, passing power down through generations.
That's definitely not very democratic.
Not at all. So yeah, Washington saying no to that idea was a pretty big deal.
It really set us on a different path.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to think about how one decision can have such a huge impact.
It makes you wonder about other turning points in history, you know, those moments where things could have gone either way.
Yeah, like what if the South had won the Civil War?
Or what if Hitler had never come to power?
Those are some big what ifs.
They are. And it's impossible to know for sure what would have happened.
Right. But it's still fun to speculate.
It is. It helps us think about the forces that shape history and how even small events can have huge consequences.
Exactly. And it reminds us that the future is never set in stone.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation.
We've learned about the myth of Washington being offered a crown, his real actions to prevent a military coup, and even his surprising royal connection.
It just goes to show that history is full of surprises.
And that there's always more to learn. So we hope you enjoyed this episode of The Deep Dive.
If you did, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our future explorations.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about today's episode, feel free to leave us a comment.
We love hearing from you.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those history books open.